Okay, in this session, I'm just going to go over some of the arguments used to suggest that the elections to the House of Commons should get rid of first past the post. So obviously, if this was an essay question, you have your introduction in your argument, you say either it should or it shouldn't. So to go through just some of the argument, and again, you can read up on these. There's a number of articles on Teams from Politics Review magazine. There's the textbooks that got stuff on this as well. But some of the main arguments are as follows. First past the post should be got rid of because it leads to disproportionate results. In other words, it favours the two big parties, and the number of seats a political party gets in the House of Commons does not reflect the vote share which that party got, and therefore that is unfair and lacks legitimacy. Some figures from the 2019 general election. The Conservatives, they got 42.4% of the vote in that election, yet they got 56% of the seats in the Palace of Westminster. Labour were roughly the same, 40% of the vote and 40% of the seats. The Scottish National Party got 3.9% of the vote across the UK and 7.3% of seats, and the Liberal Democrats got 11% of the vote and 1.8% of seats. Previously, there's been some other really big examples of this. In 2015, you got the famous example of the UK Independence Party gaining 12% of the vote and 1 MP. That's like 0.1% of MPs or something like that. So it leads to disproportionate results, which leads to questions about legitimacy, about accountability, and it not reflecting the will of the British people. Other arguments against the system are the system's unfair to small parties, which again kind of links into the point we've just made. It prevents people from wanting to vote for a small party like the Greens or UKIP or another small party because people know that the two big parties are more likely to win, and so therefore people will vote tactically as opposed to how they really want. And even when people do vote for small parties, again, their voice isn't always heard. There's that example I mentioned before about UKIP, percentage of votes and percentage of seats. Another argument against first past the post being used for Westminster is that a number of MPs do not have 50% of the vote of their constituencies. In other words, more people voted against them in their constituencies than voted for them. It's just that the opposition vote was split between a number of candidates. Again, in 2019, there were 229 MPs who got less than 50% of the vote. So that's 35% of MPs. So just over a third of MPs did not have 50% of the vote, which again might lead to questions about things like legitimacy and accountability. On the other side of the argument, those who favour first past the post say it creates strong and stable governments. You have single party governments usually being elected. These single party governments have a clear manifesto, a set of promises they got elected on, and people can hold them directly to account. Every government, or most governments, since 1945 have either been Labour or Conservative. There's been some hiccups, they argue. 2010 was an example of that, where you had to have the coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and so again was 2017. Now, opponents say this shows that first past the post does not work. Its main supporters say it provides, strong, stable governments. 2010, 2017 suggests not. However, 2019 has gone back to that pattern of a fairly strong single-party government again. The other argument for this is that are coalitions all that bad? I mean, Wales under AMS have had coalitions since the Welsh Assembly was created in 1999. Wales still seems to be functioning relatively well. Other countries around the world have coalition governments and they seem to survive, Germany, for example. But they're the arguments around that particular issue. Another argument in favour of first past the post is that it prevents extremist parties from getting elected. A more proportional system may open the door to parties like the British National Party or other kind of more extreme parties from gaining some seats. The only seats the BNP have ever gained in a UK election was for the European elections, which is done proportionally back in 2009, I think it was, or 8. First past the post, yes, it's unfair to small parties, but that's a price worth paying because it prevents extremist parties from doing well. And the issue around, well, lots of MPs don't have 50% of the vote. Well, actually, nor do many governments. The current government have got 42% of the vote. Um, and the issue there is that people in those constituencies are voting for different candidates. If they really disliked a certain candidate, they'd all vote for one person to defeat that person. So there's some of the arguments around the issue of first past the post and whether it should be maintained or got rid of for electing MPs for Westminster. Many of them are just normal argument, around good and bad of first past the post. You just need to link it in a bit more to, is it really the best way of having an elected assembly being elected in the UK?